Welcome to the Doctrine of Salvation, Module 5, explaining sacred space, sacrifice, and atonement. Last time we talked about the words faith, righteousness, idolatry. My point being, let's get those words nailed down as to what they mean in the Bible so that the story can use them in a way that now we can use them today and make sense of what God wants us to know about the doctrine of salvation. Before we get to Jesus, and we're getting there soon, there's going to be three actually, more modules to just bridge that gap between the Old and New Testaments, getting some vital information involved there. And this time is the conversation of these words that are different to us in our modern world. You've never seen a sacrifice, probably, and I'm glad I never have. You have never seen a ritual atonement, those kind of things. So I want to talk about that because Jesus' atonement will be a conversation that we'll have about the doctrine of salvation in the New Testament. But before we get to Jesus' atonement, of course, we need to set our stage in the Old. So that's what we're doing this time. This is a tough topic also because you are tempted to backload information into the Old Testament that you presume is happening in the New. And we'll talk about that here and in coming modules. Proposition number one. The Bible was written within a culture that assumed sacred protocols such as, and you could list a dozen things here, but temples, priests, and sacrifices and such are part of the world that Moses was in. He got it from Egypt and so forth. And so when we have, look at that last sentence. Do you buy this? Neither God nor Moses invented temples, priests, sacrifices. Those are things that are part of the story. It's the scenery, it's the backdrop before the play even begins. We're tempted again to say, well, God started it. Well, I'd say, show me the text. There is no text. You have Cain and Abel sacrificing, remember that, but it doesn't say how or why. And so we would be very careful, I'd say even amiss, if we try to put theology in that early. All we can say is they did it, but we don't know why. Or we need to wait if we can figure out the why. So my point is that when we come upon a tabernacle with all the dimensions and the paraphernalia explained in the books of Leviticus and Exodus and such, let's not get ahead of ourselves and say, oh, God wanted this. Because again, God's going to give them divorce law. He's going to give them slavery laws. He's going to talk about polygamy, how to handle two wives and so forth. And Jesus even admitted in Matthew that when you have divorce law, it's not because God wanted it, it's because God allowed it, or in that case, the hardness of their heart. So there's going to be some laws and some discussions, I'd say this would be one of them, where God picked up the pieces of a nation heading out of Egypt and said, here's what I want you to do now, based upon what you know before. Again, these sacrificial altars that are found in Israel, this is a model, or this has been moved to a museum, but this accords to the kind of sacrificial altars that we have around the world. Let me read this to you. This is just from a recent Biblical Archaeology Review article, but pertinent to our study. Practically every culture distinguishes between clean and unclean things, actions, and people. This is true for simple hygiene as well as for ritual or religious purity. Throughout history, various societies have developed different ways of separating the pure and the impure, usually by imposing restrictions on the movement and behavior of the impure. Remember, the leper had to say, leper, leper, and stand aside. Given the universality of the idea of impurity, it is not surprising that the Hebrew Bible, now come into the stage, the Bible, people, that's full of references to purity and impurity. The widespread attestation of taboo throughout the Bible, along with its near universality and prevalence in the ancient Near East, suggest it was indeed common in ancient Israel. The relevant texts throughout the Bible do not attempt to invent it. They simply reflect it. And so what I'm saying here, in other words, is just standard understanding within the academic world. Well, proposition number two, building on that. While in Egypt, think specifically now of the story of Israel. While in Egypt, the Hebrews didn't have a religion. They didn't develop one before this. They were a family, right? And they get enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. They learned Egyptian religion. Now, they probably had some Yahwist loyalists in the family, like a Joseph and others, but when it came to religious practices, you can guess where they looked. The rituals described in Mosaic law were thus received as familiar concepts, though designed in their case, in Israel's case, for a specific place and time, Canaan in 15th century BC. The law, in other words, as it came to the people, they didn't say, "What's this?" They would have seen laws of other nations, including the Code of Hammurabi. This is a Babylonian law code. Hammurabi was a king in Babylon. And kings always thought of themselves as Welcome to the Doctrine of Salvation. This is Module 6, the promise of exile and Messiah. We're working our way through the Old Testament, kind of coming to the end of it, of course, trying to maintain the story intact, left to right, as, again, stories move with beginning, middles, and ends. That's how we're handling the doctrine of salvation, as a story being told throughout Scripture. Well, proposition number 1, again, of our 10, in officially making a covenant with Yahweh as its national deity, a presumed possibility of forfeiture was always present. This is just how covenants or agreements work, even in marriage, when you think about it. We say at the wedding, "I will do it forever." We understand as the audience what you mean by that, and we're not offended by it, but we also know that there's this not nervousness, there's a general understanding, it's just presumed, that if one of them breaks the covenant, the other this is even in 1 Corinthians 7. Remember Paul saying, if one breaks the covenant, the other one is free to go. So I should have finished our proposition, whether for the nation or for individuals. This is how God has been dealing with us as individuals throughout the story of salvation. But it's also how God dealt with the nation of Israel. There are some stunning passages, and I was going to say, I hope you're okay with this. When I read these kinds of things, it reminds us that the Bible comes at us as a piece of literature that includes genre. And listen to this passage. It shall be that just as Yahweh, this is in Deuteronomy, rejoiced over you to do you good. That was the initial promise of Genesis 12 to Abraham. So Yahweh will rejoice over you to destroy you, bring you to nothing, and you shall be plucked off the land. This is a promise well ahead of time, not a promise, but a gentle, again, possibility of forfeiture here. If you go astray, again, don't think behavior, sin, or being bad behaviorally. If you go after other deities, this is what's going to happen to you. Then Yahweh will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve the very beings that you wanted to serve the whole time. And notice that phrase there, wood and stone. Sometimes this gives people the impression, again, that the gods are not real. This is a rhetorical device that happens usually in the later Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, where the mockery starts to foment within the language of the prophets, that here's someone holding an idol and worshiping the God that it represents. Well, you don't mock the God, because that's real, that's dangerous to do, but you can mock, in a sense, the piece of wood or stone. And so sometimes you'll see this phrase or this idea of mocking the idol. Yes, that's a possibility in the story, but that does not mean that does not eventuate in the idea that the gods themselves are not real. Again, some other promises. Here is Jeremiah. He's at the end of our Old Testament chronology. I myself, God says, will fight against you. Imagine God saying to you, I will fight against you with an outstretched hand, with a strong arm, even in anger and fury and great wrath. I'll punish you according to the fruit of your doings. So that's our first proposition, that there's a presumed possibility in any kind of a covenant or agreement that one side will drop its obligation. In that case, even here, God is saying, yes, I will fight against you if you drop your obligation. Number two, looking back, the road to exile, and here's an enigma of enigmas. Solomon, David's son Solomon. I have argued previously that Saul does not seem to be a Yahwist in his worship patterns. David obviously was. Solomon is the son, of course, of David, and he's quite the theological conundrum to us that are reading this kind of story. It is simply stunning how soon, how completely this man turns the nation over to the worship of other gods. It's almost, it's certainly adult literature in the sense of the descriptions of the things that Solomon allows in the temple. When I say adult, I mean some very gross pagan practices that are sexual in nature, things like that. And Solomon was all about that. And so it's scary stuff. This is where it starts, 1 Kings 11. But Solomon, after David died, loved many foreign women. These were political marriages, Moabites, Ammonites, and so forth. When you hear this kind of a list, you know that the gods are coming with them. So these women are coming in. Let's not blame the women. Let's just understand that when they came into the temple, they brought their gods with them. And so Solomon had them around. When he was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not, well, how do you want to translate shalom? Obviously, the word means peace in Hebrew. I just like how that sounds then. His heart was not at peace with Yahweh. Officially, he was his Elohim. Yahweh was Solomon's Elohim, but he was not like his father David. So, can you suspect what's going to happen? Yahweh became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Yahweh Elohim of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. There's two stories, and remember how Solomon has a dream. And commanded him, I like this, concerning this one, and this is in Hebrew as well, this one thing. It's like a spouse saying to their partner, all I want is one thing. Make it really simple for you how to be faithful to me. And God is saying that to Solomon. I asked you for one thing, and you couldn't do it. And you went after other Elohim. So that's where our story's moving. It's come through Saul, David, and now we hit Solomon. And from there, we are going to hit let's read our proposition number 3, the concept of exile. The exile of Israel was a corporate issue pronounced upon the nation and not upon individuals who were individually righteous. Some people are righteous, of course, like a Daniel, and Ezekiel, Jeremiah. There's going to be stories of godly people who are worshiping Yahweh, and they're going to have to suffer with the nation going into captivity because of the sins of, we've always wondered this, how did God determine what was enough to be sending all the people into exile? Was it 51%? Was it the leadership? It's hard to know. But again, this is a corporate issue. Think about this, by the way, that God did not intend originally to turn the family of Abraham, who was going to rent or sojourn in Canaan, apparently for a long time, and then the people wanted to become a nation. God even said, Deuteronomy 17, I'd rather you not be a nation, because you're going to have a king, you're going to have taxes, you're going to have your men go off to war. So you wonder, obviously, they do become a nation, and much of the story of Israel is about the nation, but in a sense, God never intended that. So here's the nation now going into exile, and that all started, when you think back, they wanted to be a nation. It makes me wonder what had happened, what would have happened if they had never been become this entity of a nation. Well, we remember then that going into exile, some people were righteous. And let's look at a passage that sometimes is misunderstood. Blessed is the man. This is right during the time of going into captivity of Jeremiah's time. Blessed is the man who trusts in Yahweh, even in this time of exile, and whose hope is in Yahweh. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Isn't that true how we have grabbed that little phrase out of that passage and we turn that into our anthropology? People are rotten. God looks down upon the human race and all he sees is a mess. Well, we're kind of grabbing a verse out of context because prior to that, he just said, I'm hoping you stay loyal. And then at the end, he says the same thing. I test the mind to give every man according to his ways. So, wrapped around this idea of desperate wickedness is possible goodness on both sides. So let's be careful about how we pull that verse out. That last line as well is important to just check, because this is a theme of the Bible, that when God looks at the human heart, he is judging it based upon a standard that he's asked for. And that standard, again, is not perfection. There's another proverb or quip that we've heard. I remember growing up with it, that God needs perfection. Where did we get that? Where have we ever? The Bible never says it. So let's be careful how we define God's character in this. And if he's going to judge us according to our doings, the fruit of our doings, what does that mean? And it's a standard stock phrase that we'll find a dozen times in Scripture. Again, I love C.S. Lewis too. N.T. Wright, I enjoy, and let me give you a very good quotation from him that defines this, and it has been the source of a lot of discussion amongst theologians today. This is from his commentary in Revelation, N.T. Wright. When God takes his seat for the final judgment, this judgment will be in accordance with the totality of the life that each person has lived. That's a very well crafted sentence, but he's trying to use every word very carefully. The totality of life. In fact, let me stop there. I remember, have you ever wondered if someone would go to heaven and God would say, you were so close. You were ready to walk down the aisle at the Billy Graham service, and you tripped and fell, remember, and broke your neck before you got to, this sounds terrible, but this is how my mind works. A guy wants to become a Christian. He hears the message. He goes down forward to meet Dr. Graham and pray the prayer, but he falls and breaks his neck and dies. And God says, I'm so sorry. You were that close. I mean, it's a silly illustration, but let's think honestly about how that could be, where a person dies potentially the day before they would have become a Christian. What does God do about that sort of thing? Well, here's N.T. Wright's explanation, and I like it. What God is doing in the final judgment is looking at the whole life, saying, here is what you were. This is how we deal with people. This is how we deal with friends. Why wouldn't God do it the same way? So let's pick it up again. Countless anxious Protestant teachers worried that this sometime or somehow does away with justification by faith miss the point entirely. When Paul speaks of justification by faith, he is talking about the present assurance of the divine verdict in the right. Remember how righteousness is just a common sense word of being proper. It's not a legal term, which will be issued on the last day. The verdict someday on my life or your life will be right. You are in the right. Notice, based on or on the basis of faith. And he uses that word pistis in this conversation to mean loyalty. Loyalty alone, that overall tenor of life, which is seeking for glory, honor, and immortality. Well, classic N.T. Wright, that's a well-packed quotation. And again, it has caused discussion, because does Dr. Wright believe that we are going to be justified by our faith in Yahweh or God or Jesus? And Wright would say absolutely. But what I mean by faith is the whole life lived. It's the way God will judge all of us in the end, on the basis of everything we've done. Well, proposition number 4. Israel was promised that an anointed human, let's talk about the Messiah concept. An anointed, that word anointed there is the adjective in Hebrew for Messiah. It's translated as, well, Mashiach, to smear with oil. It means someone who is appointed to a specific task or duty. So that's, again, it's not a religious term. but it's the word we now use as Messiah. Israel was promised that an anointed human, there's a lot of ways to talk about this human in the Old Testament. Most commonly, it's not Messiah. It's, well, servant, shepherd. The name David is given several times as though it's actually David in his role or something like that. And he's been promised that he would someday appear to redeem the nation from exile. Notice also this is a corporate thing. The Messiah concept is not that when he comes, you individually will now be able to get saved. The Messiah concept is a corporate concept, that God will bring someone to help the nation regain its position of loyalty. My favorite text of the Old Testament in dealing with messianic hope doesn't even use the word Messiah, but it's a beautiful picture. Indeed, I myself, this is God talking, will search for my sheep and seek them out. As a shepherd seeks out his flock on the day he is among his scattered sheep, so I will seek out my sheep and deliver them from all the places. How will God do that? How will God, this is said at the end of exile, Ezekiel 34. Someday God's going to look down upon his sheep and say, I want to gather you. How do I do this? Would it be God himself? Would it be an angel? Would it be a human? We aren't told in this text. But if you keep reading in that same chapter, he says this, I will save my flock, and they shall no longer be a prey, and I will judge between sheep and sheep, compared to sheep and goats, a previous statement. I will establish, and here it is, one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them. And then he names him, my servant David. Well, David's been dead for many years. He shall feed them. So what is he saying? I'm going to want to gather these sheep, and I'm going to do it by means of a person. That's the key here, is that we don't have to say it's David. Obviously, he's dead, but the idea that it's going to be, and this is so vintage Yahweh, it's going to be a human. He's going to get down and dirty with us physically and bring us back. This is a corporate concept, bring us back to loyalty as a people, as a nation in this case. But again, this is a story in progress. Proposition number 5, Israel's period of exile answered, and this is kind of a sad thing, the wishes of many Israelites who wanted to worship other gods. Here again is that genre of you asked for it, you got it, right? So it sounds a little harsh, but this is how Yahweh will sound in some of these texts. Go and cry out. We had heard early in the life of Israel, if you want those gods, you can have them. I mean, you're going to have to cry out for for salvation at times, and they're not going to show up. But that's the kind of God you're choosing. So go out and cry to the gods you have chosen. Let's see if they can deliver you. This was the warning in Judges. Well, then you get to the end of the exile, and you have, or the middle of the exile, and Ezekiel says, I will scatter them among the Gentiles, disperse them through the countries, because that's what they wanted in the first place. Their eyes were fixed on those idols. So now I'm giving them their privilege. This is a scary text, Jeremiah 8, again, predicting how the story will go. They will spread Israel's leaders' bones after they die, the ones that were responsible for the exile, before all the host of heaven. Imagine this picture. You're spreading out the bones of your prophets and kings that have led you into exile. Before all the host, again, that's talking about the gods of the nations, which they have loved, after which they have served, and after which they have walked. These are all synonymous ways of saying worship. Which they have sought, and which they have worshipped. Then death shall be chosen rather than life. Very sad story there. And Jeremiah also gets into this idea. Have you ever wondered, and we didn't have time in our course to talk about this, can gods do things? Can gods actually get involved in human issues? I would say absolutely. And here's where Dr. Mike's podcast was getting into many different helpful conversations about present day issues when it comes to the power of gods and things like that. Well, this is the same back in the days of the Bible. Listen to Jeremiah 44, again, talking about the time of exile. The people say this, we will certainly burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, this is a god from Egypt, and pour out drink offerings to her as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes in the cities of Judah. For then when we did that, we had food, we were well off, we saw no trouble. Again, this is Augustine. It goes way back where Augustine says that every heart has this hole shaped like God. You ever heard that quote? I sense in the Bible that it's teaching us that non-believers can be very happy because they're getting everything they want from the God with whom they work with whom they have a covenant. I don't know how that works, but my suspicions are when I'm rubbing shoulders with non-Christians, well, here's the point. I should not presume they're not happy because what the gods of the Old Testament were very good at doing was keeping their clientele pleased. That's why the temptation to not switch to Yahweh was so prevalent and so difficult and so hard for a Israelite to stay, I think, loyal to Yahweh when all these other gods were feeding their people quite well. And here we have a famine, shall we say, in Israel. Those kind of things I think were going on all the time. Well, we got to keep moving. Proposition number 6. Jeremiah predicted, let's move our story forward, that Abraham's initial covenant would be restored. He calls it a new covenant, Jeremiah does, particularly in bringing Abraham's family, think again corporately now, into permanent Yahweh allegiance. Here's the question. Why would a new covenant work when the old one didn't? Why would a couple that goes in for counseling, why would we suspect it's going to work this time when it didn't work last time? Well, here's my recommended answer. It gets pretty specific, so let me read it to you. The new covenant, only Jeremiah has that term, is Yahweh's gracious promise, it should be, that a replacement covenant would take the place of the covenant that Israel broke. We're going to replace it, not just tighten a few screws, but we're going to give you a new one. While still a blessing for fealty, that word fealty means loyalty. It's a blessing for loyalty arrangement. This new covenant or arrangement would come with guaranteed success. How this would be done, we're not told. The Bible doesn't tell us how the new covenant's going to be so successful, but here's my recommendation. God had hinted, however, that his love would somehow turn the story of Israel's unfaithfulness around. It's like a husband chasing after his bride in the right way and wanting her back in the proper way, or a parent who does not allow her rebellious child to walk away. That picture of, again, this is in the Bible, throwing the visual of God throwing all the teenagers' stuff out onto the driveway, saying, "I'm through with you, go." And then at night going back out and picking everything up and bringing it back in because you don't want them to go. That picture of back and forth is part of the biblical narrative. Yahweh promised that Abraham's initial covenant
Yo, can you hear me? Let me try to turn my camera on. Can you hear me, brother? Ryan's power just went out, so I guess he just texted me. I guess we can't finish it. Let me call him really quick though. Sorry for you guys who are watching. Yo, can you tell the broadcast what just happened? Or no?
I can't get to the broadcast.
I mean, I'm on the phone with you and I got my mic on.
Why don't you tell them, bro?
Well, I just
My
did.
power went out.
Well, dang, that's a
You
wrap.
still on there?
Yeah. But
All right, I'm trying to get on now. My power came back on.
Oh, okay. I don't like how fast Buddy was moving though.
Into this time of loyalty. In the Old and the New is the latter's inclusion of a human shepherd. Isn't that true? Sometimes you just need someone to show up at your door, right? We need to know that being human, the carbon-based existence that is so messy and dirty, has a friend, and that's what God will do. This is amazing to me on a practical level that the Messiah, with all that religious stuff that we add into this idea, it's a practical get down with me in this dirt of the world feel is really what happens here. A human shepherd or guide who would physically lead Israel into this time of loyalty. A person's going to make a difference. A person will make the difference in this story of salvation. And here it is. This is one of those passages. I, Yahweh, will be their God among them. Well, we got to add a person in there. So you have this again, my servant, it's me and David, is how God puts it. I will make a covenant of peace, probably referring to that same new covenant that Jeremiah is talking about. But notice again, it is corporate. It's not saying because Jesus comes, now people can get righteous. That's not how the story's going to go. It's going to be when Jesus comes, now we as a people will be loyal because God had promised he's going to get down and, shall we say, dirty with us. He's going to have elbows. God's going to get elbows and kneecaps and be a part of our world. So that's how I see the concept of a Messiah. And again, even Jeremiah here is that promise of, I will be their God. They shall be my people. That's the end of Revelation. That's how the story will wrap up. Everyone will say, you are my God. And he will say with joy, Revelation 1:4 is my favorite verse I would say in the Bible. My dad died when I was 24 and I miss him. And that verse always just makes me well up. He will be my, now I can't remember it. They'll be my people, and I will call him my son. And to have my dad call me his son, I was his only boy, and that special relationship of playing catch. That's why Field of Dreams always tears me up. To go out and have a catch with your dad was the highlight of any boy's life. And that's how I read Revelation 21:4. I'm going to have a catch with God. Got to move on. Proposition number 7, the Messiah, while important to the story, now watch this, was not or was yet a means to an end. Here's where our modern Jewish friends, and I've got some, who love to talk about this over coffee, and they're very kind to me as a Christian. I'm thinking of two in particular, a woman and a man who they don't know each other, but they both know me. And our conversations have gone like this. Well, in fact, let me read it. The Messiah, while important to the story, was a means to an end. It was God's kingdom and not a Messiah that Israel was to look for. And that's where they're still hoping for. So my Messiah, my Jewish friends, again, two independent people who I've talked to, they both say this: Ron, I understand you believe in Jesus. That's fine. But we're not told in the Old Testament or the Bible, us Jews, we're not told to look for a Messiah. We're told to look for God's kingdom, to which I agree. And that's made for some good lunches, right? What are we looking for? We're looking for the kingdom. Now, of course, I'll say Jesus gives us that kingdom. Jesus brings the kingdom, to which they'll say, let's talk. In other words, that's the next conversation piece. Is Jesus the Messiah or not? But notice we are in agreement. The Christian and the two Jews sitting at the table, as it were, we're not looking for Messiah to be right with God. We're looking for the kingdom. And that's just has to be put out there to be fair to the story of Scripture. Because look at how the New Testament will start. We're starting to get close to the New Testament, right? There was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. This man was righteous. There we go. We got a righteous person, even before Jesus comes, waiting for the comfort of Israel. He's waiting for the kingdom. He's waiting for the nation to be loyal. And then God says to him through the Spirit, you're going to see the Messiah. He wasn't waiting for Messiah. He was waiting for the comfort of Israel. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't wait for Messiah, but people generally weren't. They were waiting for this. And that's okay, because that's how the narrative of the story of salvation was working. Number 8, the coming of Jesus will fulfill the expectations of a Messiah and so much more. Understand, I'm not diminishing the idea of a Messiah. I'm saying that Jesus will say, or allow others to say about him, he's the Messiah. Jesus never says, I'm the Messiah. I mean, we've wondered why that is. He allows other people to say that, and he commends them for it. I think it's simply because Jesus knew the story that we've told so far. We're looking for the kingdom, and I'm looking for the kingdom. Jesus would even say that too. I'm bringing the kingdom, frankly. But the idea of a Messiah is kind of a second issue there. So much more. In this way, Jesus will fill up the meaning of some of the more subtle predictions of the Old Testament. All right, this is where I miss Mike desperately. We talked at length when we would room together. This is my memories especially. We would room together at conferences, and we hadn't seen each other usually for half a year or a year at a time. And that's when the lights would go out, and we'd lay in our beds and just stare at the ceilings. And well, you would swear it'd be an argument. We called it just having fun. And here was one of the places we disagreed about. He called my view nuts, just so you know the word he used. But the more subtle predictions, we're going to talk about this when we get to the New Testament. But when we talk about subtle predictions, we mean when you read it the first time, you didn't see Jesus there at all. But now that you look back, oh, there, I think I see Jesus. Well, here was the one that we had a lot of fun with. Because Mike makes a big thing of this in his writings, and I understand that. Yahweh said to the serpent, Genesis 3, you are cursed above all the cattle, more than every beast of the field. On your belly you'll go. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Well, Mike knew my view. And that is, when you lay it all out, God's talking to a snake and a woman. Think about the promise of this curse. You, snake, are more cursed than all the cattle, more cursed than every beast on your belly. That's literal, right? This isn't Satan that's going on his belly. This is a snake. I feel like I'm talking to Mike. Mike, it's not Satan on his belly. It's a snake, right? You shall eat dust. Everything you taste is going to have dust on it because you're going on your belly all day long. That's my point, Mike. The rest of it's literal too. It just means that Eve and snakes are not going to get along. Eve's children are going to walk around stomping on snakes' heads. The snake is going to be snipping at the heels of their human counterparts. To which, of course, Mike says, that's stupid. Well, my point is that's what we call a subtle, this is subtle. And if you find Jesus here, go for it. This is, again, how I would even say it to Mike. If you see Jesus here, go for it. And you know how this works in a lot of predictions. But for me, to me, it's just something I enjoy at the time in the story. It's like the lamppost in the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. I enjoy it for what it is. And if I get told later about something about that, then I'll add it into my story. I don't find enough personally in the rest of the Bible that makes this anything more than women hating snakes. Back to this illustration again. Remember, this doesn't have to divide theologians. This doesn't have to divide us, because we are all talking about this middle section of, I know this, well, I believe it because I prefer it. Well, I don't even know, so I'm going to take someone else's view, and this is kind of where we are on this issue, I would say, about the snake in Genesis 3. Do you know it means Jesus, or do you simply prefer a certain view? And that's, I think, a good way to understand these kind of discussions. Notice that the doctrine of salvation, that's where we are, right, does not depend on Genesis 3:15. If it did, we would have a story continually being told about snakes and women and whatever. You can find it, I understand that, but that's what, again, I would call a subtle prediction. And with that, let's move on to number 9. Of singular importance among the promises made in the Old Testament was Daniel's vision. Here is not subtle. All right, numbers 8 and 9, I purposely put next to each other. 8, look for subtle things. Enjoy them. This ain't subtle. Back when I was teaching, I called our twin cities in Minneapolis, I called the Jewish Christian League of something, where they would send Jewish teachers to classrooms upon request. And I said, I teach at a Christian school. Can you send one of your Jewish representatives to my classroom? And I'd like to just talk about Christian thoughts in front of him, and back and forth. And she said over the phone, by the way, this is not for proselytization. We're not intending for him to proselytize you Christians, nor are you trying to make him a Christian, right? And I said, no, we're not doing that. I just want to have a conversation. And well, let me read my proposition. Of singular importance among the promises made in the Old Testament, and by singular, I mean, I think the most important, was Daniel's vision of a human who would be given by Yahweh rule over all humans and spirit beings. Here's what I told Saul then when he called me, and he said, I'll be coming to your class next week. What can I do? And I said, here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to just have you listen to a passage of Scripture. I'm going to of the text. He said, you know what? Sounds great. He was a rabbi. He said, I don't even know, or I don't even want to know what text it is. Let's just run, spontaneous on this and have fun with it. I said, perfect, let's do it. So what I did, and I'm going to do it in front of you, is just read 3 or 4 verses from, and I'm going to make sure I can see it, Daniel chapter 7. And as I read them, pretend, because this is exactly what I did, I drew it on the board as I was reading it in front of Saul and the class of about 20 students. I watched, so Saul is standing over there, here's the board I'm drawing on, and I'm reading the text to the students. This is in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9. I watched till thrones were put in place. Notice the plural thrones, in the sense that these gods have authority. So that's how Daniel was seeing it. And the Ancient of Days was seated. So think of Yahweh being an old white-haired man sitting on a throne himself. That's what he was seeing. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. The point is, a great king will have a great commotion-laden courtroom. That, the bigger the reputation of a king, the more austere and vibrant his courtroom, shall we say. That's how it's being shown here. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. You want to multiply this by thousands, okay? The court was seated, and the books were opened. Again, the greater the king, the greater his court. And there is, no greater explanation or description, shall we say, of a courtroom scene in God's time than here. Verse 13. I was watching, now this is Daniel down here. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like a son, the Son of Man. Now in Hebrew, or here it's Aramaic, Bar Adam, meaning one who is classified as a human. A Son of Man simply means one who is classed as human. He means an actual human. This is the first time, by the way, in the Bible this has ever happened. Never happened before. And we're at the end of the Old Testament. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him before him. It's like two of the gods get off their throne. Here's my gut feeling. They march him in. They're saying, what is a human doing in our courtroom? We're above humans, Psalm 8, right? Humans don't belong here. They bring him, the human, into God's presence. And you're expected, if you didn't know the next verse, you're expecting to hear God basically wasting that human. You don't show up unannounced in any, remember Ahasuerus and Esther, you don't show up unannounced. And that's, I think, what this bringing him before him story is trying to tell us. But watch what happens. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Instead of God destroying that human, God turns and says, you get it all. Everything I am, I'm giving to you. By my decree, I'm giving to you, which shall not pass away. His kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed. My last slide is, watch Daniel there. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body. In other words, he basically is paralyzed, and he says, I don't know what to do with this. This kind of story, Daniel has had this as a vision. I don't know what to do with this. How does a human, number one, show up in the courtroom, get brought in, and then, shock of all shocks, he's given everything that Yahweh's ever had. So that's why Daniel ends up basically paralyzed. Well, all to say, that's the greatest prediction. Oh, back to Saul. I think that's what I drew basically on the screen or on the whiteboard. And I stepped back and I said, so what do you think, Saul? What's your gut say? I'll never forget his reaction. He says, and he was very kind. He stood back and he said, I have never seen this in my life. Now, I was both sad and happy at the same time. Sad that a rabbi had never read Daniel 7:14. Happy that he looked at it and he said and we talked about it as a class. He said, I can see why you think Jesus is so cool. If that's Jesus, wow. Again, I was stunned that a rabbi had never seen this before. He must have seen it or read it. It's in your Bible, but he had never seen it, put on screen before. So it was a good then half-hour conversation with us. He didn't convert that day, but he didn't convert me either. He didn't convert me back to Judaism, because what Jesus will do, here's the point, when Jesus is in front of Caiaphas and Caiaphas says, are you the Son of the Blessed? Jesus quotes that verse. He just says, you'll see me coming on the clouds of heaven. And Caiaphas rips his robe and he's dead within 3 hours. This is the event. When Jesus claims this, that will kill him. Proposition number 10, looking backward now into the story of the Old Testament, if we want to do that, thinking right to left, yes, there are opportunities to find connections. And that's why we want to open this up to this concept known as midrash. What is midrash? It's something Christians have not talked about. We need to, because it's a Jewish way of interpreting their story. I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. Remember that story? Well, is the third pig your Uncle Ned? who was a lazy guy, that would be the first pig, right? In other words, you can take a story that's a story, a historical story, and then turn it into, by means of having fun with it, seeing how things connect to your present day. What is midrash? I just looked it up on the internet. Midrash is an interpretive act seeking the answers to religious questions by plumbing the meaning of the words of Torah. It's a Jewish idea. In the Bible, the root drsh, darash, is used to mean inquiring into any matter. Midrash responds to contemporary problems and crafts new stories, making connections between new Jewish realities and the unchanging biblical text. It's a thing we have to bring back later when we get to Jesus and his death, which we'll do in about 2 or 3 modules from here. We're going to talk and spend time, how does Jesus' death affect us as Christians? And I want to introduce it now because Midrash will be the means by which we make these connections, by which Paul and Peter and John make a lot of connections. It's not something we should run from. It's something we should absorb and appreciate, and we'll do that in the future. So we've finished this module. We're now ready. One more discussion point will be the intertestamental period before we come then to the incarnation of Jesus.
Yo, what's up, gentlemen?
Yo,
What you
can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. What'd you
Okay.
get?
Buddy was moving really. So I noted every single thing, but so let's go back. So, in officially making a covenant with Yahweh as its national deity, and I'm just quoting, a presumed possibility of forfeiture was always present, whether for the nation or for individuals themselves. And I like how he provided scripture to kind of back it up. But basically how we have the option. Crap, I looked up what forfeiture meant, but basically we have the option to what is it? I guess choose something else other than him. Or sorry, I looked up what forfeiture meant and I forgot already. A loss or giving up something as a penalty for wrong. Okay, so God's or being punished for picking up other gods. That was just from Proposition, I think 1. And then yeah, I don't really know. I was trying to follow along, so I wrote everything he was saying.
Yeah.
But I've got to kind of put in side notes as to what these things mean, so I have a understanding of the whole thing. Because Buddy moves like that.
Yeah.
But I do like the last point he made about the Son of Man or whatever. So yeah.
Definitely. Pastor Patrick, what about you? I hope your connection good enough to fellowship tonight, but what's going on? You're on mute, buddy. Hold on. Oh, it says your mic isn't connected. So yeah, man, we're still live. Okay, let me end the broadcast, man. We're supposed to end it before we fellowship.